Known for her beauty, intelligence, and dramatic love affairs, Cleopatra was a powerful woman and the last active ruler of Egypt. But did you know that she was actually of Greek descent? And what makes this historical figure so appealing to us, even 2,000 years later? Together, we'll explore Cleopatra's ancestry, her family, and her portrayals in art. So, welcome to not another Greek history podcast. This wonderful series is actually part of the famous Macedonians, and I'm actually recording this in Egypt, which is an amazing coincidence. So, let's dig in. Welcome to Not Another Greek History Podcast, the podcast that aims to be exactly what it says. I'm your host, Onoufios Dovlepis, and together we'll discover the not so frequently told stories of Greece's history that will change the way you view things forever. Cleopatra's Greek roots. Following Alexander the Great's conquest and then his death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals, as we've talked about extensively in his own series, which you should listen to if you haven't. It's amazing, it's epic, it's fascinating, it's everything, it's all the amazing adjectives. By the way, I want to say that if you ever hear any noises, this is the sound of Egypt nowadays. And it would be impossible for me to record anything like this in Egypt without any noises. Imagine that right now it's 2 a.m. And of course, this place just never gets quiet, which is amazing. So, one of Alexander's closest companions, Ptolemy I Soter, took control of Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty after his name. The name Ptolemy comes from the Greek word Ptolemos. So Ptolemeos is the name. Ptolemos is a really old word that we find even in Homer in the Iliad, for example, and it's a word for war. Instead of Ptolemos, nowadays we say polemos without the T. From the word polemos, we have the word polemic in English, which is when you have some speech, some argument, which is really critical against something, which is like waging war against someone's opinion. But in English, you pronounce the name of the king as Ptolemy because it's PT, so it's like Ptolemy. But if one letter has to be dropped, has to be removed, it should be the T and not the P because Ptolemy is nothing and polemy is closer to the meaning of the word. Anyway, the epithet that comes with his name, so we say Ptolemy the First Soter, as you say in English, it means savior. In Hebrew and Aramaic, Ptolemy became Talmai. Ptolemai, Talmai. It's like the same thing happened with English. They dropped the P. Combined with Bar, which is for son, we have Bartalmai, son of Ptolemy. And that's how we get Bartholomew. Probably the name comes from that version of the name, which is really interesting. All the male kings of the dynasty were named Ptolemy to make things very complicated, and there were only 15, plus three more kings who didn't rule Egypt though. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt since 305 until 30 BC, precisely for 275 years. But they didn't rule Egypt only, because we always talk about this kingdom of Egypt and we think it was only Egypt. Their kingdom was based in Alexandria, but over time it included also parts of Greece, including Cyprus. Speaking of Greece and Greek islands, Cyprus, then Libya, Sudan, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. So it wasn't just Egypt, as we always say. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. She was the daughter of Ptolemy the XII, which makes her part of this Greek dynasty from Macedonia in northern Greece. That's why this is part of the famous Macedonians series. She too had a very common name, though. Six more queens of the dynasty were named Cleopatra, plus another five that were princesses or queens elsewhere. Her name comes from the Greek words kleos and patir. Kleos is glory, patir is the word father. Hence the word, for instance, patriarchy from patir, or we say patriot because it has to do with the land of the fatherland. A variant of this name, of the name Cleopatra, is actually if you just reverse the order of the words, and that's how we get Patroclus. Patroclus. That is a hero from the Iliad, which we have mentioned in the series about Alexander, that he was one of the role models, along with Achilles, of Alexander and his companion Hephaestion. The Greeks lived primarily in cities like Alexandria, which was founded by Alexander, obviously, and Nafkratis, whose name has to do with navs, which is the word for ship, hence the word nautical in English. But you don't pronounce this as naf, you don't say naftiko, you say nautic. So this AU becomes O. That happens, by the way, with any word that comes from Greek where we have this AU. So we say автомато, but you say automatic. Auto, not afto. Aftismos, autism. Anyway, that's a parenthesis. The Egyptians lived mainly in the countryside. The Ptolemies adopted many Egyptian customs, but still maintaining their Greek heritage. They even had an area called Elefsis or Eleusis in English, which we have, by the way, near Athens. That was an important religious center, which has to do with Dimitra, Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Unlike most of her predecessors, Cleopatra made an effort to learn the Egyptian language. This is mind blowing. She was actually the first Greek ruler of Egypt to ever learn Egyptian. She embraced elements of Egyptian culture to gain the loyalty of her subjects. Obviously, because she wasn't stupid, she was really smart. She was even presented as goddess Isis herself. By the way, Isis and other non Greek gods were also worshipped to some extent in Greece. That happened in places that were important trade hubs, such as Athens. So near Athens, we would have this sanctuary of the Egyptian gods, actually near Marathon. So even though the Ptolemies respected local customs and religion, they probably hardly ever left Alexandria to visit the rest of the country, and their court was almost entirely Greek. Keep in mind that Alexandria is all the way to the north of Egypt. There was a whole country, a big country below Alexandria, which they probably never saw. So there had to be a revolt, of course, at some point, because we said this is a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt when Alexander the Great took it over from the Persians, who had occupied Egypt before the Greeks. Alexander defeated the Persians, the Persian Empire, and part of that was Egypt. So, of course, he didn't just let go of Egypt. His generals established their own dynasty. So, of course, there had to be a revolt against the Greeks at some point, as there were revolts against the Persians, and ironically, the ones that helped the Egyptians fight the Persians were the Greeks. The best known revolt lasted about 20 years, starting from 205 BC from Upper Egypt, which means the lower part, practically. When we say Upper Egypt, we mean the south, which is weird. So, a century later, after the Greek dynasty of the Ptolemies was established, 205, it was driven by resentment toward heavy taxation and foreign domination, of course. First, it was led by Hor-Wennefer, or Haronofris, meaning Horus Onofris. Horus is the name of a god. And then by Ankh-Wennefer, or Chaonofris, meaning may Onofris live. As you can see, they both had Onofris as part of their name. In Egyptian, the root NFR meant perfect, good, beautiful, and was associated with gods and kings. It was the second name for god Osiris, and the names for queens Nefertiti and Nefertari have the same origin, and they both have the word beautiful when translated. So this Onofris becomes a name for people, as you can see, and eventually another man who lived in Upper Egypt in the 4th century AD now eventually became a saint, and that's how I got my name. Was a saint. So my grandfather was named Onufrios eventually in Greek, and that's how we get to my name. When I go to Egypt, I joke about this sometimes with my Egyptian friends, all of whom have Arabic names, and I would say to them that I'm the only one there that actually has an actual Egyptian name, because most are named Mohammed, Ahmed, Karim, Abdallah, and so on. Cleopatra's identity and cultural fusion. Cleopatra's obvious mixed cultural identity made her a unique figure. Just like Alexander, the Ptolemies positioned themselves as pharaohs. They respected the local religion and built more temples, which look like the ones that the Egyptians had built. And that's why you can't really tell if anything was built by the Greeks. For instance, when you visit Egypt, and you couldn't possibly tell the difference between something built in 1500 BC or built in 100 BC, which is really, really weird. So that's how we have temples like the Temple of Horus at Edfu, or the Dendera complex, or the Philae temple complex. A relief of Cleopatra and her son Caesarion in English, is at the Temple of Dendera. The Greek kings were depicted in the temples all around Egypt as the ancient pharaohs and with the royal serpent at their foreheads, with the exception of the important ones in Alexandria. A lot of these places I visited, by the way, during the Nile cruise, which is a must if you visit Egypt. So keep in mind when you come here and your guide mentions the Ptolemies building some of those buildings, they mean the Greek rulers of Egypt. I think that they kind of forget to mention where the Ptolemies were from. Just so you know, for me, Egypt is definitely a destination for real travelers and not just for the average brainwashed tourist. I've said this many, many times for those of you that have listened to my podcast before. You simply cannot, no, you simply can't not visit Egypt. So, yes, I'm talking to you, okay? You listening, I'm talking to you. Enough with Europe. Egypt is a must. Cleopatra was educated in the Greek tradition with subjects like philosophy, rhetoric, and science. Her tutors would have included some of the most learned Greeks in Alexandria. She was a multilingual genius, that's what they say, that she even spoke up to 9 languages. Even if it was four, imagine, it's still a lot. I mean, I, for instance, can actually speak 4 languages. I understand more than four, but I can't really say that I speak more than four. If I have to, I can speak maybe a little bit, a fifth or a sixth one, but fluent, no. But she was fluent in 9 languages. That's what they say. Her fluency in all of those languages and her intelligence, of course, were important for her diplomatic success. She didn't need translators. And now let's get to the place where she lived, where the palace was, Alexandria, the great Greek city of Egypt. To understand Cleopatra's world, we need to have a look at Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, Alexandria was the port where goods ended up from India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the rest of Africa. It was also a melting pot for Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and other cultures. It quickly became one of the ancient world's greatest cities and still is the largest city of the Mediterranean, which is really impressive. As the book The Life and Time of Cleopatra says, the Alexandrians are sons of the Mediterranean, not children of the Nile. Arthur Weigel is making the point that people living there are not really in touch with what we normally have in mind as Egypt. And that, of course, you would see if you go to Cairo, which is all about the Nile, or all about the desert because the pyramids are next to the desert. It's not only the locals that are not really in touch with the rest of the country, the tourists also are not really in touch with Alexandria. Alexandria's architecture and layout were based on Greek ideals. I'm mentioning this to highlight that the city was very different than the rest of Egypt and didn't feel that much like an Egyptian city. The same author that I mentioned says the city was Greek in character. The temples and public buildings were constructed in the Greek manner. The art of the period was Greek. The life of the upper classes was lived according to Greek habits. The dress of the court and of the aristocracy was Greek. The language spoken by them was Greek. It is probable that no one of the Ptolemies ever wore Egyptian costume except possibly for ceremonial purposes. It may be remarked that the modern conventional representation of the great Cleopatra walking about her palace clothed in splendid Egyptian robes and wearing the vulture headdress of the ancient queens has no justification. And if she ever wore the ancient dress of the Egyptian queens, it must have been only at great religious festivals or on occasions where conformity to obsolete habits was required by the ritual. The city succeeded Athens as a center of learning. Athens had Plato's Academy. Alexandria had the Royal Library, Bibliotheki, library. I can hardly say that word to be honest because it has two R's and that's very difficult. So the Royal, there's a third one. The Royal Library aimed to house all knowledge of the ancient world.
And to perform the functions of my office conscientiously, that's okay, and the best of my ability. Conscientiously.
We'll get it right.
Alexandria also had the museum, a research institution that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra herself studied at the museum. Culture thrived in Alexandria. Scientists like Euclid, and Archimedes made revolutionary discoveries. Herophilus, considered the father of anatomy, lived there. Scholars translated Egyptian texts into Greek, preserving ancient Egyptian knowledge. Thanks to a multilingual inscription in Greek and Egyptian, we were able to decipher the hieroglyphics. When I say we, of course, I'm not part of that. I wish I were, but my knowledge is very limited. But that would be, of course, the Rosetta Stone that was deciphered roughly 2 centuries ago, or a little bit over than 2 centuries ago. And of course, it is in the so called British Museum in London. Why would it be in Egypt, right? That doesn't make sense. The word hieroglyphic, by the way, comes from the Greek words sacred and carving. Hiero is the word sacred, holy, and glypto has to do with the word sculpture, sculpting and carving. That's how we have, for instance, the word hierarchy, which means the rule of the sacred people, meaning that the priests were really important in antiquity. For example, at the Theater of Dionysus in Athens, we see that the front row seats all of them have the inscription priest. The first word that they mention is the word priest. They were the only ones sitting in the front row. And then we have from Glypho, as I told you, for instance, in German, there's a museum in Munich called Glyptothek, which means the museum for sculptures, practically. That was the parenthesis. So keep in mind the word hieroglyphic, the word that we use for that kind of writing comes from Greek. Of course, it doesn't mean that they in antiquity used that word. The Egyptians didn't use that word. Keep in mind that also the word Egypt itself comes from the Greek version of the country's name. Egypt, not the name Egypt itself, the version of the name comes from that. Egypt comes from Hot Kaptah, meaning palace of the spirit of Ptah. That was the name of the temple of the god Ptah at Memphis. In antiquity, Egypt was likely called Hemet, where the word chemistry comes from. And also alchemy is chemet, chemistry. Alchemy is Arabic for the chemistry. The most famous scholar at the Ptolemaic court was the geographer Eratosthenes in English, Eratosthenes. He was the one that accurately calculated the circumference of the planet. Yes, I said planet. A person without computers, without satellites, without modern technology, was able to almost precisely calculate the circumference of the planet to understand, to realize how big the Earth actually is. Which means, of course, he knew the Earth was not flat, he even knew how big it is. It's mind blowing. Another incredible scientist who lived there was Aristarchos of Samos. Samos is an island in Greece. He was just the first person that we know who placed the sun in the center of the world, and that was in the 4th century BC. So forget about what you might usually hear that people in antiquity didn't think the sun could be the center of the world. Some of them did, but many of them, if not most, thought, believed that the Earth is the center of the world, of this whatever system they thought it was. Another one was Sosigenes, an astronomer. He was really important in reforming the calendar under Julius Caesar in 46 BC. Probably at Cleopatra's advice, Sosigenes proposed a solar-based calendar with a 365-day year, adding an extra day every fourth year, which is a leap year, to account for the Earth's actual orbital period of 365 days. The older calendar was corrected in 46 BC when we had a year of 445 days, as they called it, the longest year in history. As Wiggle wrote, but for Cleopatra, some entirely different set of months would now be used throughout the world. So it's thanks to her, who proposed Sosigenes, who helped Julius Caesar, and so on. The Julian calendar was slightly too long by 11 minutes per year. So eventually the Gregorian calendar refined it in 1582 after 1500 years. The month July was named after Julius Caesar. Sosigenes was also depicted in the Cleopatra movie, the famous one. I don't need to even mention which one I'm talking about. We're going to talk about this movie quite a lot throughout this podcast. And it's at the point where Octavian murders him in Rome in front of the Roman people. That was fictionalized, though. That didn't happen. So these are the people that we should know before we even study anyone from Europe, from the rest of Europe, because some are Greek, so they were European, of course. And I'm talking about Western European people because we tend to know them more than a lot of the ancient heroes, let's say, of science and so on. And of course, there would have been, I'm sure, many more in Egypt, the Middle East, as we say, Mesopotamia, and so on. So before we even study anyone like Copernicus or Galileo, which are names that I'm sure all of you have heard, I think we need to know first the ancient masters, not the people who might have read some things that those ancient people had said, or who discovered some things, of course, on their own, but that happened 2,000 years later or 1,500 years later. Apart from the ancient Greek scientists and scholars, the Greek community thrived in the city of Alexandria until the 1950s. So to this day, the Greeks feel a strong connection to Alexandria. The greatest and most popular Greek poet ever, Konstantinos Kavafis, was born there. He died in 1933, so to give you an idea what kind of time we're talking about. He wrote several historical poems, including one about a son of Cleopatra. Alexandria was also home to the famous lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, showcasing Greek architectural prowess. Its height was about 138 meters. I'm surprised that it's so precise. Let's say 140 meters, more or less, which means only a few meters lower than the Great Pyramid in Giza in Cairo. Its ruins are now underwater and also integrated into an Arabic fort that you can visit in Alexandria. After the famous Mark Antony that we're going to be talking about, of course, in the 1st century AD now, another Mark would leave his mark in the city. My wordplays are on fire. Christianity would be introduced in Alexandria by Mark the Apostle. For anyone that remembered or didn't know the movie Agora with Rachel Weisz, there was also a woman that was a great scholar in the city. She was called Hypatia, but she lived much later in the 4th century AD, so even after the establishment of Christianity. And she even got to be killed by a Christian mob. 4th century AD, by that time Christianity has become an official religion, imagine, within the Roman Empire. How nice, right? And we're not done. This is to be continued in the next episode, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share. Until next time, this is Onoufiros Dovletis signing off from Not Another Greek History Podcast.